There are over 200 million repositories on GitHub. About 10% of those are Java repositories. And in this vast body of code, we decided to find code smells. This was part of a research project funded by the National Center of Research and Development in Poland. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about what code smells are, then the research context. I'm going to describe it in more or less detailed way. Then I'm going to walk through how to obtain samples, how did we approach the problem of obtaining code smell samples from this vast body of code. Then we'll cover the grading stuff, because we still need people to review the code to decide whether it is a smell or not. Then how did they do that? So what tools did they use? What knowledge did they have available? And finally, I'm gonna cover the problem of industry relevance, whether our claim, how do we back it? So why do we claim that this data set that we produced is industry relevant? First, the code smells are code fragments, basically any code fragments. Sometimes those are parts of a single class, and sometimes the code smells are spread over several classes. And generally, they are thought of as symptoms of troublesome design. They were conceptually, code smells were introduced in the late 90s. The first mention, at least the first official mention, is by Beck and Fowler. And thing that is worth noting here is that code smells are indicators of troublesome design, but they do not necessarily pose problems. So it might be that code fragment will be identified as smelly code, so a code that does not look well designed, but actually it might be a specific code fragment or a specific solution that requires this approach. So for the future discussion, it is worth mentioning that while code smells are generally perceived as something that should be avoided, they are not defects themselves. So while they are generally most developers recommend to avoid them, they are not. It's not like they should be avoided at all costs. Our research covers the green parts on this image. So starting from sample selection through sample grading and obtaining code smell samples. Project selection I will cover briefly, but it is something that was covered in an earlier study that is quite heavily related to this one. And next one, so later this data set is used to feed machine learning models. This is also out of scope for this one. So we're gonna cover sample selection, sample grading, and the flow between those. So first we started GitHub. So this immense organization that has over 200 million repositories. And out of those, we decided that we only want to cover Java because it's one that we think is most common in the research area. So we can at least try to compare with other results. So out of those 20 million repositories, we need to select ones that will be reasonable to analyze. So those 20 million obviously cover all the pet projects and other forks, projects that are already archived, that are not developed for a long time. And basically they cover everything. So we obviously need to do quite a bit of filtering here. So what we decided is we started with selecting organizations that may have code that is relevant for us. Remember that we are looking for industry relevant software, so we want to feed our model only with samples that can be reasonably assumed to appear in production code and a real life industrial project. So the good candidates are projects that are used often, projects that have started as commercial projects, and generally mostly the bigger ones, to be honest. So the selection, organization selection is the first step. So the biggest organizations, corporates are selected. So the likes of Microsoft and Google and IBM, and also Apache, because it is kind of often a sink for many projects that are no longer commercial, let's say, or at least that are open sourced but started off as commercial ones, such as Kafka or HBase or Hadoop, Hive, for example. So after we've selected organizations, and this obviously is a lossy selection. So if there is an small organization that delivers high quality product, then this product will not be included in the in our data set, which does not bother us that much, because we are looking not necessarily for a very high recall, but more for obtaining projects that are relevant, and not necessarily all the relevant projects. So after that, we need to do some project selection, such as removing forks, generally cleaning up the data. And after we did that, the next step would be cloning the repositories and obtaining the samples from the code. So samples, there are two types of samples in our data set that we present. First is class smell or class sample, and second one is method sample. And in our case, this is a fairly simple split. So basically, everything that is class-like, which means classes, interfaces, abstract classes, go to the class pool, and methods go to the method pool. Now, in the Java 8 and the newer, it's not that obvious, because there are things like lambdas and inner classes and abstract and anonymous classes, which are not do not fit very well into this separation, but it's more or less correct. I mean, more or less. Well, we did of course define the specifics of how this should behave, but these problems will occur, and they will occur in basically any language. So if you decide to go with Go or Python, you will encounter other problems, such as how to handle modules, or how to handle internal definitions, or maybe something that is executed inline, etc. And then after we split our classes into those two pools, we perform random sampling. Now there is a filtering step ahead between those. So we do remove classes that are less than 5 lines long, which basically means it's just a definition and possibly possibly some base classes, and we remove methods that are 3 lines long, which is mostly getters and setters. And that's because those may be treated as smell per se, but inside that there's nothing really interesting. I mean, there's nothing you can say that is bad inside a getter. You can say that the getter itself is bad, but not that something inside it is bad, because there's nothing really inside. So then we do random sampling of those. Now there are many more methods than classes, which means that our sampling needs to be adjusted for that. So we sample from random pool. So when we present a sample to our reviewer, it will be either a class or a method sample with 50% possibility of each, and then we randomly sample the pool. Finally, we were able to gather over 40,000 reviews, and most of them, over 9,500 reviews, were done by developers with over 5 years of experience, professional experience, and only less than a fifth was done by developers with less than 2 years of experience. So our staff was pretty experienced. Our grading staff, the people who graded the samples. So we had 2 main sources of the staff. So we cooperated with software house. So people from the software house were able to support us in gathering this data set. And other part was the graduate students, and those were obviously those are obviously people with less experience. And roughly that's half of the staff was from the university. Half of the staff were students, and the other half were developers. As you can see, developers gathered more samples, but that's something that can be expected, as this was part of their role. Then for the grading staff, we did a survey that would give us detailed information about their professional experience, their education, their attitude towards code smells, their experiences programming languages and programming paradigms, and the attitudes towards that. And this survey is anonymized, of course, but included in the data set. So we hope it will be able to shed some light on differences in code smell perception by experienced developers and inexperienced ones. Our developers were presented with a tool for this grading. So in the middle, so the left part, this left panel here, is the source code sample. So in this case, this is a function. So a public static synchronized some function gets Java 6 factory from plugin. And here we get this source code of this function. If this is a class sample, then it's the same, but it's a class written here. Then on the right we had a panel with some with actions. So first of all, if the developer decided that this information from here is not sufficient to decide whether this is a smell or not, we provided a full source file link, so he could just click here and go to the and be redirected to GitHub to the proper file. Then the information about the review. So how many reviews have you submitted? We did try to avoid having very high inequality of number of reviews, but that's, well, didn't go perfectly. So here is the grading of a smell. So for method smells, two smells that were analyzed were long method and feature envy. And for classes, it was blob, or also known as god class or long class. That's pretty much, we treated this as same. And the other one was data class. And the developer could have selected that this sample does not exhibit the properties of the smell, or this is a minor occurrence of the smell, or a major occurrence of the smell, or it's definitely a smell, and it's the most typical. It's like critical and should be fixed. Should be fixed, or at least this is definitely a smell. So this is the area of reviewing, and once these were clicked, you could select next and take another random sample. And then there were some instructions. So a little bit about these smells. We mostly assumed the developers know what they are talking about, because they had the experience to do that, and students had a short introduction, and then they were asked to gather more knowledge themselves. And mostly this was planned because we wanted to get as high we wanted to extract the understanding of the smells from the community and not impose understanding of smells on the community. So we couldn't give very precise instructions. So this is just a brief introduction of what this smell is about. And the procedure was fairly simple. So the system was randomly selecting the sample. Then the sample, the developer was reviewing the sample and grading it. Then, if the sample the developer decided that the sample does exhibit a sign of smell, then there was a verification phase. So another developer got the same sample to regrade, let's say. And this was only a cross check. So the other developer did not see the initial grade. So this was done independently. So we did avoid this. We did that in hope to avoid this bias that this was already graded somehow. And if the grades did not match, so for example, one of the developers decided that this is a minor problem and another one decided that this is a critical problem, then there was an arbitrage, which means that the third developer got the same sample to grade. And all the samples are either all the samples in the data set have went through these phases. So if it was decided that there is no smell, then it was there is only a single sample for this code, for this piece of code. If there was decided that there is a sample, that there is a smell, there are either 2 samples if both developers agreed, or 3 samples if they don't agree. And all the samples are present in the dataset. And when it comes to metrics, we gathered nearly 15,000 reviews from nearly 5,000 samples. And they were taken from over 500 projects. They're all Java projects from big, mostly big repositories, and well known. So we did our best to make sure that those are as industry relevant as possible. There were 26 reviewers, and we did ask them to analyze for 4 code smells. This research was done as an industrial project as part of a CodeBeat software tool, software that is used by developers to detect pieces of code that should be modified, that should be addressed, the problems that should be addressed. We used repositories that were industry relevant, and samples were graded by experienced developers from the industry. So we claim that this is as industry relevant as it gets. Thank you for listening, and that's it.